Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. We're going to look at Europe's answer to an unprecedented migrant crisis. Since the start of the warm weather on this continent, tens of thousands have crossed the Mediterranean on makeshift boats chartered by unscrupulous smugglers who very often leave passengers adrift for days. Nearly 2,000 are thought to have perished, but that exact toll is a mystery. After public outcry and an emergency summit, the European Commission unveiling a quota system this Wednesday for EU nations to share the burden. 20,000 migrants to be let in over the next 2 years, among most, but not all, of the 28. The UK, Ireland, Denmark getting a waiver. Too little for some is this quota system. That's less than, the 20,000 is less than half of those who've arrived this year alone. Too many for others who see mandatory resettlement quotas as an incentive for yet more to make the perilous journey. Today in the France 24 debate, should all EU nations share the burden when it comes to migrants? With us from London, Conservative member of the European Parliament, Richard Ashworth. Many thanks for being with us. Here in the studio, we're joined by Arezo Malakuti. You're Director of Migration Research at Outcry Consulting. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
And Nicholas Vineker, Paris correspondent for Politico. Welcome back, sir.
Thank you. Good to be here.
The France 24 debate, where you can join the conversation on Facebook and Twitter, our hashtag F24debate. The plan unveiled this Wednesday. It's still at the proposal stage. It needs to be ratified. The idea to share the burden so ports of call like Italy and Greece don't take up the brunt of the slack. Claire Williams has the story.
Military patrol vessels like this one join cruise ships and fishing boats off Lampedusa's coast. At only 120 kilometres from Tunisia, the Italian island is a key transit point for migrants, and it's at the heart of the EU's migrant crisis.
I hope they do something. Now Italy and Europe are thinking about it. Let's hope they solve something now. Otherwise, this will end badly.
Arrivals are being kept in a holding centre. They're waiting for Italian authorities to decide whether to grant them asylum and let them stay in Italy or send them back home. Last year, more than 60% of refugees in Europe were given asylum in just 2 countries, Germany and Sweden. The EU's Executive Commission on Wednesday said it planned to temporarily relocate asylum seekers from so-called frontline countries like Italy and send them to other member states where their applications would be processed. It also wants refugee quotas for each country based on wealth, population and unemployment.
Shared responsibility among Europeans also means that we have a good basis to share responsibility with our partners in the region, in the world, and with the international community. And I expect coherence and consistency.
Other main points in the EU's agenda on migration include saving more lives, targeting traffickers, possibly by destroying boats before they're filled with migrants, sending immigration officials to origin and transit countries, and speeding up asylum applications within the EU.
The second of those 4 points, targeting traffickers. We're going to pick up on that a little bit later because it's a bit vague and it can mean different things to different people. Let me begin with you, Richard Ashworth. You heard the EU foreign policy chief in that report talk about shared responsibilities. How do you feel about the fact that the UK is one of only 3 nations in Europe that won't be letting in migrants under this quota system?
Well, look, firstly, let me say I'm immensely encouraged that the 28 member states are now sitting around a table talking about the problem. For far too long now they haven't. They've pretended it would just go away, and it hasn't. I'm encouraged by that. I'm encouraged that we are accepting it as a common problem and we're looking for common solutions. But what the British government has said is just setting quotas is not the answer. Just setting quotas are actually just A, encourage a greater migrant flow, but B, it's not tackling the heart of the problem, and that's what we need to do.
Not tackling the heart of the problem. We can listen now to the Home Secretary, Theresa May. She was, of course, reconfirmed in her post after the Conservatives' win in the general election last week. She spoke to the Times of London, and she warned that by not sending economic migrants back, the bloc was, quote, encouraging them to come. Let's listen.
We need to deal with this terrible, callous trade in human beings. And partly that is about the expertise that can help to interdict the criminals and deal with them. And our National Crime Agency is working with Europol. We're offering that expertise as well. But also I think it's important that the criminals aren't able simply to say to people, if you pay us money, we are going to put your lives at risk, but don't worry, you will get to Europe. And that's why it's important that people picked up in the Mediterranean can be taken back to Africa.
Taking people back to Africa. Do you agree with that, Orezo Malakuti?
I think that's a very heavy statement to make. And I think that when we look at the flows coming to Europe today, I think the push factors, or the factors that are pushing people out of their homes and causing them to instigate these journeys, are much stronger and more influential than the pull factors, or the factors that make Europe attractive to them. And I think that probably should be more of a focus, understanding those push factors and therefore understanding that whatever policies we put in place here to make Europe less attractive is not necessarily going to stop the flow of people that need to flee their homes or find safety elsewhere.
All right, but do you agree, though, that today's announcement could be an incentive for yet more to come?
I think that I would feel that it's probably unlikely, because I think that it is really the things that are pushing them out of their homes that are causing them to come to the North African coast and to board these boats to Europe. And I think it's the same argument that was also applied to rescue at sea operations such as Mare Nostrum. But I think it's highly unlikely that these initiatives or interventions are causing people to make the journey. They may facilitate their journey in some way. It may make their reception different, but I don't think it's the reason that people are beginning these journeys in the first place.
All right, give us one or two examples, specific examples, because I know that you do research in North Africa, specific examples of people who will be undeterred no matter what, they're coming.
Well, I think if we look at, for example, there are in Europe in 2014, 45% of the arrivals were Syrians or Eritreans. And if we look at people coming from Syria or Eritrea, these are people that are fleeing very grave circumstances, either conflict, in the case of Syria, war and conflict, or a very repressive regime, as in the case of Eritrea, and compulsory military conscription. And so these people are fleeing a situation that they cannot live in. And so no matter what obstacles we try and put in their way, they flee because they have to and because they are looking for safety elsewhere.
So they're not economic migrants, they're asylum seekers in your view?
That's right.
Richard Ashworth, should Europe be letting in all Syrians and all Eritreans who are trying to make this perilous journey?
Look, we've got to understand this problem. When people are in boats in the Mediterranean, it's too late. You've lost control and you're dealing with a humanitarian crisis. A more intelligent solution is to get to the issue before that. Now, previous speaker was absolutely right. I mean, if they're genuine refugees fleeing for their lives from countries like Syria, of course we can't push people back into the sea. Of course we can't send them back to their country of origin. We have to tackle that problem, and we have to actually take control of the situation and manage the flow of genuine refugees. Once you've done that, then you can start to toughen up on people traffickers and economic migrants, for example, taking preventative measures with Frontex to stop people crossing the Mediterranean, and you can toughen up with illegal actions against the people traffickers. But we really need to make this differentiation between genuine refugees who are fleeing for their lives and economic migrants who are just looking for a better life.
But you just heard Orezo say 45% of those were Syrians and Eritreans. Would you say that we can do the math, but there's been, what, 50,000?
Well, I accept that. I accept that. And I'm saying that actually a higher percentage of the people in boats are refugees. They are people from Syria and, as you say, Eritrea or Sudan, people who are fleeing for their lives. And they're lucky to be alive. But once they get into boats, it's too late. It's a humanitarian crisis, and you've got no option but to bring them ashore. Of course you must. But what I'm trying to say is we need to get closer to the source. The European Union has to perhaps think the unthinkable and actually open offices in those troubled zones and invite those people to come and prove that they are genuine refugees, and in which case bring them to Europe through a proper formal process rather than risking their lives in open boats. Now, that's a world of difference between that and people who are coming as economic migrants looking for a better life. I don't blame them for doing that, but there has to be a limit to the number we can take.
Nicholas Vinegar?
Indeed, I think what he's talking about is going to the source and possibly setting up sort of immigration offices in Libya to triage the applicants and see who indeed has been expelled from their home and who is fleeing a bombed out city in Syria, which is a great idea. But Libya is also a war zone currently, a very dangerous place to do business, and setting up any sort of administration there seems a bit far-fetched. What's the next thing we can do? The next thing we can do is to destroy the boats, destroy the incentive.
Which is what the EU foreign policy chief talked about when she was before the UN Security Council this week.
Quite right, and it's you know, an option that has been in the back of people's minds for a while. And when this migrant crisis gets to be really acute, it comes back. What would that mean concretely? That would mean essentially launching airstrikes or military attacks, not just on the boats, but there are workshops where these boats are now made, and there's a little cottage industry in setting up. I mean, you might have seen that when you were there in making these migrant boats, because they used to be purchased from different ports in Europe, and now they're made on the spot. So you have to go and dismantle the boat workshops. And then what do you end up? You end up with a pool of stranded, desperate people in northern Libya. You know, and we might have solved part of our problem, but you know, their situation is only going to get worse from there. So.
I would agree. I think that if we look at Libya today, the situation of migrants in the country is horrifying. And
Federica Mogherini, by the way, the EU foreign policy chief, this Wednesday, saying there's not going to be an invasion of Libya. She put that, she ruled that out.
Right. Yeah. And so I think, but and kind of continuing on from the previous point, I think setting up any kind of processing centres in Libya is probably out of the question, because the situation of migrants and asylum seekers in the country is not safe. But I also think on the point about smuggling, I think it's important also to look at it from a different perspective and understand that the smuggling industry is a bit of a symptom. It's not really part of the problem itself. And I think that this industry will continue to thrive as long as there is a demand for irregular migration. And the only way that you dismantle that demand is to provide regular pathways or legal pathways for these migrants. And in my experience, most of the migrants I interviewed at different places in North Africa, in Libya, in Morocco, Egypt, Tunisia, many of them did say to me, if I had options to instigate a regular or legal migration, I would have done it. But I didn't have the option. So I got onto a boat, or I put my life in the hands of a smuggler.
Lots of reactions. One on Twitter from Mick. What if Ireland simply can't afford to take them in? We have poor families here that can hardly afford to eat. Richard Ashford, what do you think of the fact that 28 nations and only 25 are going to take part in this quota system, and Ireland, Denmark, and the UK are left off that list?
Well, what they're saying is we want to see more detail about what these plans involve. And for what, let me say straight away that we have a very proud record in the United Kingdom of taking migrants into the country. We've taken, on a per capita basis, as many, if not more, than most other nations. So we're not being uncompassionate about this. But can I come back to the original point that, you know, the member states have ignored this problem for so long, hoping it'll just go away. Well, it won't. Because we've ignored it, we've lost control. Control has been taken over by the people smuggling gangs, and because of that, we've got a humanitarian crisis. Now, actually, I repeat my point that just putting in quotas right now is tackling the symptoms. We've got to, this is a long-term problem, and we've got to get back to the cause of it. And as previous speaker said, we've got to formalise migration routes so that we can take control of migration. It's out of control at the present.
Richard, a few weeks ago, there was the Australian Prime Minister and his Foreign Minister touting what they do over there, which is they send the boats back. Your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, with the greatest respect to the Australian Prime Minister, who has done a remarkably good job in his country with immigration, he's not dealing with migrants who are fleeing from Syria, from Eritrea, through Sudan. He's not dealing with people, refugees fleeing war zones. He's dealing with economic migrants. And it's perfectly reasonable steps that he's taken. We are, in Europe, a humanitarian group of nations who are prepared to take compassionate steps, and we're not going to certainly ignore these people, leave them in the sea, or send them back to war zones where they came from. That's not possible.
Reza Malakuti?
Yeah, I think that I agree on many of the points that were made, but I think it's important to look at it's a very complex issue, and there's no one magic solution, I think, for this situation, and there's no one way to solve to resolve the issue. And so I think ideally we need to look at it on a time frame, like immediate responses for the midterm and responses for the long term. And I think in the immediate term, a quota system can be useful to relieve some of the pressure on the frontier countries like Italy, Spain, and Malta.
I think it's 50,000 that have come in so far this year, and 30,000 of those to Italy.
That's right. I mean, in 2014, Italy received something like 80% of the flow that came into Europe, and it was over 200,000 migrants. And the reality is that most of the migrants that arrive in Italy don't actually want to be in Italy, and most of them are trying to move to other European countries like Germany or Sweden against EU regulations. But the reality is that Italy is dealing with the bulk of the issue when most of the migrants don't even want to be there themselves. So I think interventions like this can be helpful in the short term, but we also need to think about what we want to do on the medium term and on the long term to have a comprehensive kind of look at the situation.
All right. There was, over the weekend, Nicholas, a disturbing video that was released by an aid organization, not in Italy, but here in France, in the port city of Calais, which is the gateway to Britain. There it was French police who've now opened an internal investigation who roughed up would-be migrants trying to sneak onto trucks crossing the channel. It seems as though both sides are feeling the pressure. When I mean both sides, I mean the locals and the migrants in Calais at this point.
Indeed. I mean, I think we have to keep in mind that this is an extraordinarily tolerant city. Calais has been, the focus of all the migration pressure in France. It's the place that actually has to deal with the migrants. Britain may not want them, but these people are living in, makeshift camps in Calais until they can actually reach the UK. So it's a constantly tense situation there. And I looked at the videos, and what you see, that sort of dance between the police, it's not a dance until they start beating them up, but before that, that's a ritual that goes on every day. And
many of the locals unfazed say we see this every day.
4 to 6 times a day. There are even times when they're kind of agreed times when we're going to, the migrants are going to rush the trucks, and they're going to rush them at, different locations, and they decide by nationality or ethnicity who's going to go where. And the game is, cops and robbers, and the police run after them and try to take them off. And, this is a problem that's existed for years, but there are flare-ups of violence and migrants fighting amongst themselves. And also what we're seeing here is what looks like police brutality and a kind of callous and it looks like casual violence is what it looks like in the videos. Just kind of police who are so sick of doing this all day that they've started to lose sight of who they're dealing with, that these are human beings, and they needed to be, arrested or intercepted in an orderly way. I think it's very well for Britain and the British government to call for solutions, at the very root of the problem. But the very root of the problem is way outside of our reach for the time being. And the European problem is taking place right there, and it's taking place in France, and Britain is saying, we don't want any part of that problem. And I think that's a source of a lot of frustration for the southern countries that actually have the people in their land and have to feed them and clothe them and care for them.
Richard Ashworth?
Yep. Yeah, no, I absolutely disagree with that point. To say or imply that Britain doesn't want to be involved and doesn't recognise the problem is not true. The point that I'm making is that for far too long now, we've just ignored this whole immigration issue.
But not when it came to Calais. You didn't ignore it when it came to Calais. We tried different solutions.
But you see, no, but even when I talk to people in Britain or in Calais, they just see it as a local problem. They don't see it as a whole migration route issue. I mean, I think this is a long-term problem which our children will be dealing with. There's no quick fix here. We've got to realise the world is changing, that there's inequality of wealth, that there are things like climate change, there is violence. And global mass migration is something our children will be dealing with years from now. So actually looking for this quick fix solution now so the media can move on and there's another story tomorrow, actually long after the media have gone, this problem is going to be here. And what we in Britain are saying, look, we've got to find the long-term solutions. And for a start, you've got to get back to the heart of the problem, get close to the source of it so that you can begin to deal with it in a proper manner. Long term, way beyond our horizon, no doubt, but we've actually got to put overseas aid into those countries and stimulate and hope to create a better country that people don't want to leave. But we live in the world we're in right now. We've got to deal with the problem. But actually, just to worry about boats in the Mediterranean is dealing with the solution and dealing with the symptoms, and it's far too late.
Richard Ashworth, I want to thank you for joining us from London. I want to thank our panelists here, Nicholas Rushworth and Arizo Malakuti. Stay with us, though. Our Media Watch segment is next.
Up by now.
All right, we're joined now by Emma James. Emma, you've been looking at reactions to, again, it was 28 nations agreeing to a solution where 25 will be taking part in these quotas. The UK is not on the list.
Yes, absolutely. And if we start with a look at what Theresa May herself had to say in the Times today, which is what really... Yes, absolutely. And this is all down to her, if you will. Now, obviously, it's a very human tragedy, this whole crisis, but it's also provided a very political dilemma. And what she says in this article is that the EU itself is putting migrants at risk here. She says the situation is intolerable, but she highlights the criminality of those profiting from the misery of others and, of course, their desire to be able to build a better life somewhere else. She says we can't do anything which encourages more people to make these perilous journeys. Now, she quotes figures from the UN Refugee Agency estimating 3,500 people died in 2014 trying to make those crossings across the Mediterranean. That's 5 times more than in 2013. But if we take a look at this article here in the Independent, now they have some figures from this year so far saying that some 60,000 are believed to have made the crossing. And 1,800 of those have died. Now, of course, these figures are always very approximate because there is no way of verifying exactly how many people have tried and exactly how many people have perished. But those numbers are 20 times the number seen in the same period back in 2014. Now, as it points out, the UK isn't compelled to take part in this EU plan. But one diplomat has said that's not going to help Cameron make any friends. But it might do when it comes to the British electorate, because, of course, he's promised them a referendum on EU membership. And there's an opinion piece from The Telegraph, which is a conservative right-leaning paper. And that really highlights the EU agenda. It is right at the very bottom of this article, but it really, in a nutshell, rather spells out if Britain is to take in some of the huddled masses washing up on Europe's southern shores, that should be decided in London by politicians answerable to the British people, not in Brussels by bureaucrats accountable to no one. Now, of course, this really feeds into the kind of anti-EU rhetoric that we've heard from the right wing for a long time. It's what brought about the UK Independence Party. So maybe this is all about playing tough guy with the EU and saying, hey, we're not going to be dictated to, rather than it being actually about the policy in and of itself.
What was interesting to see in the statements that Theresa May has made is that she spends most of the time talking about tackling the smugglers, and inserted is a little insert saying send the people back to Africa.
Exactly. If we look at the Refugee Council, they've tweeted today, the UK government seems oblivious to the fact that the world is in the grip of the greatest refugee crisis since World War II. A British journalist, Cathy Newman, she's tweeted, yesterday David Cameron promised compassion, so why is his Home Secretary shunning drowning migrants? It really does depend which side of the political fence you're sitting on, how you view this one. Now, the Daily Mirror is a left-leaning British paper. They've been speaking with the Italian EU Minister, Sandro Gozzi, and he has basically blasted this whole idea of turning back migrants and not allowing them into the UK. He says it's very short-sighted. He points out these are people fleeing beheadings and famine, and they're risking their lives to try and get a better life. He says the EU deal would share the human cost. At the moment, 4 countries are really bearing the greatest burden out of 28 of the member states. He says the EU must have a truly common policy on immigration. Elsewhere, though, if we take a look at this article, again from The Telegraph, now Theresa May has been talking a lot about economic migrants, trying to draw a distinction between people fleeing the war in Syria and those who are maybe trying to just find a job for themselves. And that includes people from Eritrea. But if we go back to this article, which was just last month, talking about Eritrea and why people are fleeing it, saying it is actually the most repressive regime in the world, worse than North Korea. So is it right that she's calling these people economic migrants rather than asylum seekers or refugees?
All right. Certainly, Richard Ashworth was not calling the Eritreans economic migrants. He was saying they are genuine asylum seekers. I want to thank you, Emma James. I want to thank our panel once again. Thank you for joining us here in the France 24 debate.